Welcome, Mike. Sorry, yes, Michael.
So, thank you for having me. It's quite an honor to come and speak to you. I've been through the Future Leaders program. Congratulations to all of you for applying and getting in. And I really hope it's a wonderful 6 months. I've also seen the agenda for your Law and Justice Week. I'm really happy to hear that you're going to the Constitutional Court tomorrow. It's a pretty special place for me. I think it's a pretty special place for a lot of people in South Africa. And I really hope you have a great tour around it. But I've seen some of the speakers who have presented you. So Janet Love, she spoke to you in the first moment. She's my boss. Mark Hayward, Jaffa McCarter, these are the big leaders of the NGOs in South Africa. I work at one of them. But what I'm hoping to do is to give you a slightly different discussion, and that's to talk about setting up smaller NGOs. During my time at the LRC, I've been fortunate to be party to setting up 2 NGOs. The first was the Hillbrow Community Advice Office, which we established in 2013, and then the African Legal Center, which we established in 2014. So I've been asked by Sumaya to discuss effectively 2 topics with you. The first is the notion of community consultations. So pretty much any NGO you want to look at establishing outside of the technological space is going to involve communities. I want to share with you sort of 5 reflections I have about the work I've done within communities and also discuss it with you. I'm not the biggest fan of my own voice, and I see far more benefit out of group discussion than out of lectures. So I'm hoping we can discuss these sort of 5 reflections and leave here today considering how best we can engage communities and ultimately empower people in South Africa and broadly on the continent. Then the second part of the discussion will be about the African Legal Center, which is an NGO I set up a couple of years ago, which really looks at court reporting and dealing with African legal mechanisms. I want to discuss why we formed it, how I went about persuading people to work with me and share the idea, and ultimately how we want to move it forward. At any stage, if you have questions, if you have queries, if you have concerns, raise them, let's debate them. I know there's 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers, but as you know, I'd much rather prefer discussing as we move along. All right, so let's start. I've only prepared 4 slides, an introductory slide, a concluding slide, and then 2 substantial slides, 1 on each topic, and it's solely got 5 points on each slide, and this is what I want to discuss. So I started my work at the Legal Resources Center, which you've heard about, but we're a public interest organization. We do a lot of work with communities. A lot of the work of the LRC is premised in rural areas. When I moved across to the Constitutional Court in 2014, I saw that there was a slight gap in the market for community consultations and legal assistance in urban areas, particularly in Hillbrow at the time. So myself and a few clerks decided to set up what was called the Hillbrow Community Advice Office. It lasted for 3 years, and that then filtered and joined some of the larger NGOs. But what I want to discuss is sort of the dichotomy and comparisons between rural community consultations and urban community consultations. But before we do that, and it's a question I often have, it's a question I think this country's looked at during the recent Fees Must Fall protest. What is a community? How do people identify as a community? And how, as members of the NGO sector, as public interest litigators, how do we define what a community is? So do we have some suggestions from the floor? Think about yourselves. What community do you believe yourself to fall into? Is it the broader African community? Is it the South African community? Do you base your community on religion, on gender, on ideology? Do you base it on a common cause? So what is your community? Do you have some suggestions?
I think communities are largely based on or interpreted along the ideology lines. Because I think it's difficult to say, on general line, to say that maize, maybe a group of maize are a community. So I would say maybe a community is something, a group of families, let me say a collective of not individuals, but a collective of people living in the same area, and we end up having one way or the other having a common purpose, or either to survive, to whatever it is, a common purpose.
And that common purpose could be a shared illness. It could be a shared desire to affect change. Was there another submission? Does anyone have a counter suggestion to it?
I think I would define community in 2 ways, both a community of geography, so my neighborhood, the city, and sort of proximate communities, and then also geographies or communities of interest. So whether that's religious communities or people or communities that share similar interests that cross geographic lines. I think it would have some nice ways.
And to the extent that you'd want to establish an NGO, sorry.
I think that including contact with other people so that it's a community, because this decision to be made as to what principles you like to get and what is safety, what safety means to you, even in the family already. This decision to be made as a community. Are you going to start going forward with your lives? And then it stretches from there to
That's fair comments. I think a discussion we're going to have slightly later is who makes decisions for communities as well. And I think it's a very interesting topic because communities do need decision-making structures. And how do we move ahead with that? Were there any other points on this concern? Anyway, so looking at it, I want to sort of give, from a legal background, sort of 3 different examples of communities we've come across. The first is in Majakaneng. So the LRC does a lot of environmental and mining law. Majakaneng is a town. It's very close to Marikana. It has a lot of the same social and development issues that Marikana does. And we were called into Majakaneng early last year. There was a water crisis. I don't know if you remember, but there were mass protests that took place in Majakaneng, which led to the Premier going into the town to advise the community that water would be supplied. We were called by 6 young members of the community. They were all EFF aligned, they were all male. And they asked us to litigate on behalf of the community to get water. They also told us that they could get 200 signatures. And those 200 people out of a community of 20,000 supported the water litigation. However, the ANC structures in that community had set up what they called the Water Committee, which the rest of the community sided with. So we come in and we start getting this tension. As some of you may know, I'm not certain, is anyone studying law in this room? Is there an interest in law? But when you go to court, and again it's something we're going to discuss later, you have to have a definite party. So who would we be going to court on behalf? Are we going to court on behalf of the Majakaneng community? Are we going to court on behalf of the 6 individuals? Or are we going on to court on behalf of the 6 individuals with the list of 200 signatures? It's just an example of how we start defining these communities. The second is the Fees Must Fall movement. Highly publicized student protests throughout the course of last year. We represented students at WITS and at UJ. Our Cape Town branch worked with UCT to some extent. And we had grave difficulties. The basic premise behind Fees Must Fall is that it's a flat structure. There's no leadership. There's not supposed to be leadership in Fees Must Fall. But now there's a legal issue. They get taken to court. The university wants them to take further protest action. Who does the university cite? One arbitrary student who they think has committed a criminal offense, and the second respondent, the university cites any person seeking to engage in protest action. That means Barack Obama was not allowed to protest at WITS. Stephen Jobs, whoever, any person in the world was interdicted from protesting at WITS. So we look at the notion of that community as well. The interdict ultimately was not successful, but this is a broader legal community that we're looking at. How far do we go? And then the third is a community in Groendal. Now, Groendal is also a mining-affected area just outside of Rustenburg. And this is quite a sad story, but there's a group of about 300 male miners who are all foreign nationals, and they were dismissed in 2009. They've exercised all their appeal rights. They're not going to be re-employed. Labour Court, Constitutional Court has ultimately dismissed their appeal. They will not leave Groendal because they believe the mine owes them their pension funds, which accrue to around 350 rand. They've been fighting with the mine for 6 years. They're starving, they eat cats. We saw them eating a falcon recently. They refuse to leave the mine on the premise that they have this dispute that they believe to be ongoing with the mine, and until it's resolved, they will not leave. But now within this community, we also have members of the hospital who are living and dying from AIDS. And we now have the subsect. So who do we represent? The instruction from the Groendal community is to move ahead and find pension funds. We know that there's a serious right to food question. We also know that there are serious health concerns in and around the hospital. But the instruction from the community is to move ahead solely on the question of the pension fund. And again, even within what would be perceived to be a definitive community, you have subsects. So it's just something for us to start thinking about. When you want to establish an NGO, if you want to start working in civil service, who are you providing a service to? You have an idea. It might be a wonderful idea. Who's going to buy it? Is it the broader community? Is it a younger community, an elderly community? Is it an urban, is it a rural community? And before you start conceptualizing these ideas, Like you would in a commercial practice test the market, you also have to test community viability, community willingness, and the actual services that people need rendered. All right, so just to kind of conclude on a legal point, and it's something that was touched on briefly, I think ultimately, in terms of law and in terms of establishing or registering NGOs, you always would act on the cause. So I think any person, regardless of geographic location or ideology, as long as they're acting in a common cause, it's a lot easier to define a community. That for me is always the baseline test, of course subject to multiple exceptions depending on circumstance. All right, let's go to the second question, and we touched on it briefly. So the second reflection I've had, and again we're going to rely on this example of Kroondal, is the community should define the issue and not the lawyer or the funder. Now this is maybe a sad truth that I have to introduce to you, but it's something you should be aware about. To run an NGO, you need funding. Funders are going to give you money, but they want to see certain results. And oftentimes funders don't have access to the ground. They're not at grassroots. So I can give you an example. They'll come in and say, listen, over the course of the year, we need to litigate 5 housing cases. We need to get 100 people unlawfully detained out of prison. But we're not certain what's happening on the ground. Another example would be they want you to litigate a food case. So we go into Kroondal. We meet with the community say, we accept that we're starving. We accept that members of our community are dying of HIV or AIDS. But what we actually want is to pursue this pension litigation. Now, what is the role of the NGO, of the lawyer in that circumstance? You can see that there's clear constitutional violations in this community. You can see there's clear legal redress, but the community doesn't want it. And you also have this external pressure of a funder requiring you to meet certain funding requirements during the course of a funding year. So it's this difficulty you start running to. We discuss it ad nauseum at the LRC. At Hillbrow, we discussed it a lot as well. And ultimately, the basic premise is you have to act on community instructions. I personally can't speak for rural communities. I've been fortunate never to have to live in poverty. I've never had those experiences. I can't purport to be a community voice. And to the extent that I start standing up in court or presenting to partner NGOs that I am a community voice, there becomes a great disjunct between the actual reality on the ground and the argued reality in the urban areas. So another consideration is always to have the community instruction. It's so easy to try to point out and advise, and of course you can indicate that alongside the pension fund litigation, you can realize a whole range of other remedies, but ultimately the decision should be that of the communities alone. All right, now follow through in the establishment of community-based structures. Coming back to our discussion, and particularly with Fees Must Fall, which I think is fascinating, is how do we set up a community structure? If you're in the NGO sector, if you're in a relevant community, or if you're going to litigate for a community, how do you actually engage with the community? So let's look at Fees Must Fall as an example. Do we have a flatline structure? And if so, how does it work? What is the functionality behind it? What we often do as the LRC is we go into communities and suggest they set up community-based structures, democratically elected and duly representative. And we ask, that's difficult. We can't consult with 20,000 people every weekend. We can consult with 10 community leaders who are elected by the community to run that cause. But these are all practical issues you have to look at should you work with communities. Are there other ideas? Are there other experiences that people have as to how best to channel a community voice into a single communication stream? Examples, thoughts? How would you do it? You're called to come now and represent a community of 20,000 people, or assist that community in establishing a school, for example. How do you do it? Do you drive into the community and then what?
So I think outside of the let's have community meetings and town hall meetings and sessions like that, I think social media technology does offer some new innovative means of consultation. Yeah. So Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, Twitter hashtags, whatever it is, where voices can be heard and information collected.
Very simply, you can go to a community and you can do one or two things. If people cannot read or write, you can get someone to kind of set up a group and you guys verbally discuss what they need, you write them down. Or you can give them pieces of paper and they literally write down what they feel they need regarding to what you want to offer the help to. So just get it written on paper. When people write things on paper, it's more concrete and you can get it honestly. When you don't understand, you can also ask as well.
Any other suggestions?
From there, then we appoint the key persons and the community that will represent the majority of the people.
All right. So, I mean, I think these are interesting topics. Just as a very side anecdote, we do a lot of protest work at the LRC. On what days of the month do you not hold a protest? For 5 days before the end of the month or 5 days before payday, because everyone's run out of data. We compared it last year. The height of fees must fall was when everyone had data. The corruption march protest failed because it was the end of the month and no one could communicate on social media. Just something for young activists to consider. But it's a very, very valid point. I think social media has taken on a role completely different to what it was considered to be. And oftentimes the best way is to start WhatsApp groups, which is a way that we often communicate with community members. We don't have to phone, it's cheaper, there are data costs, but they're very, very limited. And I agree. Meeting with members of the community is a good way to go. What happens with what we're seeing in South Africa is quite a polarized political society. So,
sorry, this is a question for everyone actually. Does anyone know what the social media penetration for South Africa is?
in Africa.
For South Africa specifically?
No, I know we're 7th in Africa. I don't know what yeah. As far as I know, I think 12 million people have access to the internet, which is a quarter of our society, 25%. That was in, I think, 2014 World Internet Stats. But we're getting there. I mean, it's a start. We don't nearly match Egypt and Nigeria, but we're getting there. Another question, which is something I see within the agenda and something you're going to be studying over the next 6 months, is the polarization, the politicization of a lot of communities in South Africa. And it's not something we can just beat around the bush. Whenever we go into communities, you have an ANC and an EFF split. The EFF in most of the minor communities in the north have taken almost a 50% share of each community. It's happened. That's what it is. And oftentimes, because the economic freedom fighters are looking for the most radical change, it's their shadow ward councillors or community members who are taking the most active steps to try to affect community change. So they're often the people who are going to call you. They want help. They want roads, they want services, and they want you to assist the community. So we have this polarization. You go into your community, and you have an ANC and an EFF split. You have to start navigating this political terrain as well, because ultimately, from my perspective, we go in to defend constitutional rights. But we can't negate the fact that there's serious political undertones that occur within communities. And it's always something we have to be very, very subtle about, not to seek to be aligned. I think that's the primary reason the Legal Resources Centre particularly has lasted for 30 years. It's never aligned itself politically. It's defended any person where there may be a constitutional violation, and that's the nature of the LRC. It's also what NGOs seek to do, so they remain non-partisan.
To add on to what you're saying, it's the same reason why Business 4 has a flat structure in terms of leadership, because most of the people that are involved, they also have sort of political undertones or belong to particular political organizations, and so if one of them is seen to be a leader, then they could be mistaken that, because it is a non-partisan organization, so it could be mistaken that the movement belongs to one particular political organization, which is what sort of compromised the movement last year when it was sort of hijacked and made to look like one political party was protesting against itself. Well, that's it. I mean, when the students went, I think it was on the 24th of October when the Union buildings were stormed. I remember watching it, and we had been working with a lot of the student leaders, the legitimate student leaders, not only student leaders, but those who were the face of certain movements. And we saw the negotiations take place with the president. A few students came out and said that there was some form of agreement. And everyone looked, people started tweeting, saying, who are these people? Who are these leaders?
They don't represent us. They aren't our leaders. Well, that was the general social view at the time. I don't know the intricacies of it. But then again, there's all these subsets of communities. It makes it really, really difficult to navigate. You had something to say?
No, I just wanted to comment that instead of those leaders who were there on the ground, they took SRC presidents, of which half of them were not even there in Christmas, but they were just there in the office. So,
I mean, it's something to consider again. I mean, I don't think there's a... Yes, you had a rebuttal.
To add on to that, as well, the SRC presidents, the SRC, although it is a legitimized student body, they also carry out mandates from national politics, or the national partisan political sort of organizations. And so what happens is that you have the SRC body, which is sort of a prefix system for national agendas and for national political agendas, even though they are not essentially business for as a movement. But then, oftentimes, the media then wants to engage and address the business for movement. They speak to the institution, and the institution then places those SOC figures who are politically aligned as the faces of business for.
And that's not dissimilar to many communities we work in, either urban or rural. They are proponents. They are ward councillors who are politically aligned. And these are all questions. It's not to say that it should pervade your thinking or negate any of the work that you want to achieve. And it's not to say that you have to enter the political fray to achieve anything. It's just to be cognizant of it, to understand why certain people are approaching you on behalf of so-called communities and why.
On that note of business fall, I think there was, I know that there was a leadership, but however, the varsities did not recognize that leadership. So hence there was a bureaucracy. They had to appoint the SASCO members, the SRC, which are biased to whatever campaign which was that they needed to represent. So I think it's a bit far-fetched if we're saying there wasn't a leadership. There was a leadership. I was one of the guys who were there, and I remember we even said there was a day before the Brixton case. We made a request that we should take off our political hats so that we should neutralize the situation. Hence, it was a bit tense at the APK. You understand? Because there was a leadership and there were people who were prepared to take the struggle forth.
One and then two.
So,
and three.
My question is simply then, you are saying that they are ward members, etc.
Sure.
So obviously I wouldn't look at them as a fragment of my success, like not really a fragment, but a kind of a pathway that's going to start my success to help in this community. Have you guys ever had any problems though with them being the people that kind of stop?
Well, it can be difficult. So, I mean, you go into a community and you need instructions. So I speak from a legal perspective. You need instructions to act on behalf of people, to litigate whatever basic services in question. And we agree to act on behalf of a portion of the community. The next thing we hear, that's the ANC aligned faction or the EFF aligned faction. And immediately there's backlash from the other portion of the community who effectively seek to veto the entire process to change the community good. So there is this tension, and it shouldn't be prohibitory. The best thing to do is try to bring the community together around a common cause and try and make it as apolitical as possible. But you have to engage in that investigation first. But particularly this year, I mean, going into local governments, going into any election year, and with the increase of opposition parties, in our democratic processes, it's something that I think most of civil society will have to contemplate for quite a long time going forward.
In a situation where, I think some of the because I'm not sure how to go about the subject of election where it's indicated that NGOs should not align themselves with political parties. So let's say now in a situation where we have an example of the Freedom for the movement, which they protested a long time for money, and the other part is that they somehow taken as if they are affiliated with a certain political party. Now, what is an approach that should be taken when you find yourself between the two? Protest is a whole judgment, or as an NGO, maybe one way or the other, you find yourself in a situation. Here's a political party here.
So if I can answer directly, and it's something I wanted to bring up, and it's quite a sensitive topic, but it's sort of your notion of what you want to do. So I know a lot of the speakers have addressed you on the Constitution. At LRC, that's our job. We defend the Constitution every day. And the question is, particularly with Business Fall, we knew there was a whole bunch of politics going on. But ultimately what we were doing was defending the baseline right to protest. So as much as I'll defend the right to equality, everyone has the right to protest. I mean, at UJ, they were saying that students could protest provided they protested on a field far away from everyone. What is that? That's not an exercise of your free right to protest. Like, I'll treat you equally, but only when we stand in a shopping centre together. It makes absolutely no sense. The right is unbridled, there's no caveat. So an example, and this was what I was talking about, what is a community? It's also what happens if you don't like the community. This is at a lawyer. Let me give you an example. The American Civil Liberties Union is one of the biggest litigating NGOs in the world, based in America, but it does a lot of proactive civil rights work. They decided to defend neo-Nazis in a protest through a Jewish suburb. They were criticized substantially for the work they did. And they came back and they said the reason we did it is because, again, we were defending the baseline right to protest. I take a slightly different view. I think our Constitution limits free speech and protest, which can be read together, to the extent that a protest would constitute hate speech. And there, I think they overstep the mark. But it's these questions you have to have. How far do you go in defense of the right? Whether you like the people you're defending or not. Whether you want your NGO to support people or not, how far do you go in providing access to education, or access to food, water, legal services, whatever it may be. And it's a tough moral dilemma. I don't know what the answer is. We fall back on the Constitution, it's our guide. But there's a lot of work in the NGO sector that won't have these direct legal ramifications. And then I guess it's an assessment tool that each NGO makes. How far do you go in providing assistance? There was one question, and then one more, and then we'll move on to the next point.
Yes, myself, I'm currently running a small NGO. So the problem that I have with politicians, they will come to you to say, or maybe according to them, they don't believe that you can actually run a community project that is not even aligned to any political organization or so on. They often see me as a threat. They believe that if I'm not with them, I'm against them. So, and then because somehow they fail to strategize and the like. So when I do my own things, they will come to say, can you offer us platforms only for events? Where can you do 1, 2, 3? So I'll say, no, I'm running a community project, it's inclusive. I mean, I don't say, no, this one, because if I will start to associate myself or align myself with any political issue, I mean, I will start to be, to say, oh, because we are setting with DAs or electricians and so on and so forth. And then when I do events, I will normally call the council, the one is owned by the DA guys. I'll call the council and say, council, come on your behalf, in your capacity as the ward council. Not just say DA, what. So others, they feel like, no, man, we call DA guys to come and address and do the tracking on your events and so it's just,
and as future leaders, I think it's just that subtlety of having to deal with it. It's not saying you can sidestep. You're going to have to deal with all political interests, not play them off against one another, but try to the extent possible to keep everyone happy. And then ultimately you can provide your service unabated. But it's difficult and it takes a lot of time.
I just wanted to disagree with what he said. You can't really exclude political parties when it comes to protest, because that's your starting foundation when you are mobilizing. Usually that's where most people have interest. So that's where you get most of your numbers. So the role of political parties during protest is very important, and we cannot go on and say, no, we'll go forward without including political parties. That's where we're supposed to start. Whether we agree on certain things remains to be seen, but political parties are very important.
I saw 2 quick hands come up and battle. 1 and 2.
I have to unfortunately disagree with that, because I feel that if it's a situation like you have spoken about water situation that affects you whether you vote for the DA or the ANC. ETOLS was a situation where you saw many political parties coming together. Yes, it was led by the DA and EFF, but the situation was that the people were unhappy about not being informed about a change in policy. So what I'm saying is, sometimes if you come with an apolitical perspective, you might actually find that you get more support. Because if you're going to say something that's DA or ANC led, then you might not get EFF supporters. And then you lose the common cause, and it ends up becoming something about party politics, and you're not trying to compete, you're trying to solve that problem, which is water for the situation. So I think that if you have the mentality, then I don't know how you're going to move forward in South Africa, because you can't always make everything about party politics.
Can I take 1, 2 responses? Can I then move on to the next point and we'll come back? So 1 and then 2.
I don't know. I also think maybe we should be a bit sensitive about differentiating between the theoretical formation of NGOs and actually NGOs in practicality. And from personal experience, I've realized that the political arena actually does play quite a big role into, I think, how successful the NGO becomes, and eventually in terms of funding. You would get that in certain communities, like Sinclair, for example, the community I work in Soweto, the ANC is quite an important party, at least in terms of how far your project or your NGO, at that time will progress. So sometimes I'm sort of creating these affiliations, maybe even if it's not to necessarily push the entire ANC ideology, does to a certain extent help with mobilization, and I think further with the community, because of sometimes just coming as an individual and saying I have this idea is sometimes not as influential as a party that people maybe have some sort of created, I don't know, a loyalty towards. When it comes to then they some sort of respond to it.
I appreciate all the comments and concerns. I think it's a fascinating debate. Should we maybe take one more point on this particular topic and maybe use the last 10 minutes to broaden the discussion? It's a fantastic discussion. How far should politics influence the NGO sector? And how much do we need politicians? It is an interesting debate which we have to deal with head on, but I suggest we maybe get through a few more of the other points which may lead to other discussion and then come back to it.
Okay, and just to wrap this point up, right, with Business School, as a member of Business School at this university, see, what then happens is that when you do involve party politics, is that it becomes a violent space. Dialogue becomes impossible, especially when you do allow people to come into a meeting space around what I believe is a new era of perhaps even what we've come to know as an NGO or as a mobile political tool, because Business Fall, and as the era of the hashtag is sort of, creates this line between a political organization, right, although it doesn't sort of contest for elections, and it's also sort of like a non-governmental sort of structure as well, but it sort of rallies everyone behind a particular cause. With political organizations, what then happens is, fine, this is what we want to do, we want to push free education. Oh no, but Julius is marching to Constitutional Bill tomorrow, so all my comrades, all my guys were all going to march with him, we're not going to be there. Oh, but so-and-so is giving a speech, comrades want us there, so sorry, you know what I mean? So what happens is that with political organizations, they have these vast issues that they all want to tackle at one time, and that's why most of the time you never really see much materialize in trying to handle a lot at one time. Whereas with this hashtag, this sort of new political or community sort of emerging, people rally behind one particular cause, and the mandate becomes clear. So allowing parties then to come into that space, or allowing for a face, for a leader, because that's the thing. So it sort of revolutionizes the whole thing, this sort of hashtag, this movement, right? Because political members are not disallowed, except for ANC members at Wits University. No one wants to sit in because they want to hijack the whole thing and call it their own. Because they have the power to do that, because they have the capital backup, because they can easily hijack. They've taken most of our ideas and called it their own. It's happened numerous times, right? So no one sort of wants to, but the other political parties are not disallowed, because the idea is to rally behind this one cause without saying that it belongs to one person. So yes, fine, political structures are important because they can give you the numbers, they can give you the media attention, they can give you, but I do think that we should embrace what's happening with this sort of these hashtag theorists.
Well, it's an argument that social movements are the new NGO sector.
Yeah.
Political parties, NGOs have had their time. There's obviously still a place for them. Civil society will always need to be there to provide basic services, but the social movements are the new way forward. Interestingly, we had a planning meeting at the LRC, and there's quite a few young lawyers. There's also some very old senior lawyers. I had to stand up and explain the cases out there. And I had to stand up and I said, I'm representing two hashtags. I represent United Against Corruption and Fees Must Fall. And in law, there's a lot of problems with that. They aren't definitive people, there isn't a real client, and these senior lawyers looked at me and they were shocked. How can you represent a hashtag? Anyway. So going on to the third point, which is just a brief point so we can maybe move through them. Follow through in the establishment of community-based structures. We've dealt with briefly how to do it. And this leads into proximity and the creation of expectations. This is something I experienced quite a lot. I've seen it, we made mistakes at Hillbrow, we made mistakes at the LRC, and it's creating expectations in the communities which are often difficult to meet. So a lot of the bigger NGOs are based in the urban areas. It's easier to establish there, there's funding there. And oftentimes we undertake to drive out to generally mining affected communities to provide assistance. And just the very virtue of meeting with the community starts creating an expectation. Of course, people have driven out to meet with you and to understand your issues. So it's not so much about perpetually limiting expectations, but having open and frank dialogue with communities. This is what we can offer, and we can offer it once a month for the next 6 months. This is what we can offer, and we can only offer it 5 months from now. But what I've done in the past, and I was guilty when I was younger, I said, yes, of course, let's take on this case, let's do this, let's take on another case, and let's do this, let's take on that case. And eventually you've taken on so many cases, you actually can't win any of it because there's too much work. So it's all about being realistic, both with the capacity that you have within your specific NGO, as well as being open with the community. And I've seen the more we do it, the more you open and engage in honest dialogue, the more respect you generate and ultimately get to that core issue that the community wants to deal with. And then the last point, and this is an interesting point, and again, I think it's been touched in your previous discussions, but I think a lot of community work, and particularly community consultation, should always have the empowerment undertone. Far too often I'm accused of it often, I think firms at the LRC are accused of it quite often. It's that we go into communities, we take over, we run litigation, we get them a constitutional court judgment and we leave. We don't assist with establishing the structures, we don't assist with uplifting the community, and ultimately we leave a community having won an entire 5-year court battle without the community learning anything about the law that we're relying on. So I think a lot of work needs to be done. What I find fascinating, and of course I accept a lot of the, the historical reasons behind it, but when the big labor federations march, they march around the Freedom Charter. They don't march around our Constitution. They're very similar documents, and the reason, I believe, is that the Freedom Charter was far more inclusive. I mean, you read about the history of the Freedom Charter, suggestions for provisions came in on rolls of toilet paper, on pamphlets. There was vast community consultation. Gadesa, in the drafting of our Constitution, took a public participation role, but it was more left to the political parties to negotiate on behalf of the people. So I think the Freedom Charter is still seen as the people's document, and the Constitution is seen as an overarching law that we just have to comply with. So for me, I think all of us, regardless of whether in the legal sphere or not, the promotion of sort of the constitutional ideology is what binds us. The Freedom Charter is unfortunately not law. It's not something you can stand up and defend and say, I deserve a house because of the Freedom Charter. But you can use the Constitution to do that. It's a more powerful legal document, not a more powerful social document, a more powerful legal document.
Why don't they go to the two out of interest? Is it because it's ANC related or?
No, so I mean, it's like a brief history, and this is again just my interpretation of it. The Constitution is based on a lot more than the Freedom Charter. So the Freedom Charter came primarily from suggestions from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Our Constitution adopted a lot of work that the Canadians had done, the Germans, the Indian Constitutional Court. We looked at some of the more recent international treaties and merged that sort of all into one progressive document. So it's just about being closer in time. I think the international human rights movement developed quite a lot from the 60s onwards, and the Freedom Charter came just before then. So that would be the distinction between the two documents sort of on the international level. But yeah, so that's a big concern for me. And then ultimately, and again, this is where we spoke right at the beginning about, who speaks on behalf of the family, who speaks on behalf of the community. And just an interesting anecdote, we went out to Burgersport, which is in Mpumalanga. There's a lot of platinum operations that are starting there. We had a community consultation, and we asked the community to set up a structure. There was an equal split between men and women, and the nominated structure was 12 men. And we said, listen guys, we're just not prepared to go ahead like this. There has to be representativity on the structure, otherwise we're happy to leave. We need to hear all the voices in this community, and you can't indicate in our view that it's only male voices in the community that should be heard. It's a tough line to pull into something. You have to negotiate each circumstance, and whether it's rural, urban, depending on a whole variety of factors. But I think from the NGO side, it's not solely about appeasing the client or assisting the community. It's also about pushing what you believe to be as a human rights-based agenda. So if you have to put your foot down about gender, racial equality, sometimes it's appropriate to do that. So that's a suggestion just from the community side. Do you have any sort of brief reflections from your side? Any further questions or comments? Yeah.
I just have a comment in terms of my experience with NGOs.
Sure.
So I'm from Cape Town originally, and I'm from Rubelethu, which is a small, not really small, a biggish township in Cape Town. So because of the socio-economic realities there and the context in terms of unemployment, poverty, and in access to education, we find that there are a lot of NGOs who come into our community. And I've always had an issue with that, primarily because of the fact that sometimes you find that NGOs come with already having diagnosed what our issues are before addressing us or before finding what actual issues are. And of course, like if you have a very superficial understanding of what the problem is, then obviously your solution is also going to be very superficial because you haven't really engaged with what the actual issues are. And also, like, just an anecdote is one time when this other religious organization came into our community, and instead, well, what they say is that they were trying to improve literacy, which is fine, and it's a very commendable thing to do. But then I have an issue if your improvement of literacy is based on making people religious, then it's a problem because then you're coming in with ulterior motives. So just like it's very important to go into communities with like positive and also very transparent and objective reasons, not just try and conscientize people to what you think they should be doing.
And just clear lines of communication, what you seek to achieve and why. And if that's a position an NGO wants to take, that's fine, but it should be disclosed in my view.
Yeah.
And open up that line of communication because there might well be members of the community who really want that service. So I always think just the first community meeting should be sort of a truth-telling session, just to get to know one another and explain. If you are coming into community, why? Guys, I'm coming in because I've got a donor requirement that we need to engage in participation around a new bill. We would like to engage this community, assist with constitutional literacy, and in return we hope to be able to assist you around litigation in housing, whatever it may be. But to have an open discussion, people can actually suss each other out and determine what's really going on, both from the side of the respective NGO and from the side of the community. So those are some brief reflections from my time there. It's by no means a closed list or prohibited, and it's by no means a sure sort of solution to community engagements. But hopefully through the course of the discussion we've opened up a few ideas about how better we can all engage in communities and how we can ensure that, ultimately human dignity and dialogue pervades all of these interactions. All right, so the next part of the presentation, on my watch I've got about 15 to 20 minutes left. How's everyone feeling? I know it's the so-called graveyard shift after lunch. But do you want to go on just through the ALC? And this is maybe just a slightly more practical discussion anecdotally about how I worked alongside others to set up this NGO, what we're doing and why we're doing it. 10 minutes, does that include discussion or outside discussion? We've got 20 minutes left. 10 minutes. Okay. So just briefly, the African Legal Centre is an initiative I set up at the end of my year at the Constitutional Court. So in 2014, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to clerk for Justice Blessing Kabinda. And in my view, as a young lawyer, it's a really nice job to have. As a young person, you sit in one of the primary corridors of power, you work with the 11 Concord judges, and you see how the judiciary actually gets it done. So I'd suggest anyone who is pursuing a legal career just to consider applying to the Constitutional Court. You learn a lot about one of our spheres of government, and it's just an interesting place to be. But anyway, so what clerks used to do, there's 11 justices, each justice has 2 clerks. Whenever a new case came in, the clerks would call what's called a seminar, and we would discuss this case. And it was very similar to some of the discussions we're having today. It got quite robust, people disagreed with one another, but ultimately we had these fascinating discussions about the law and came to suggestions that we could put forward to respective judges. I missed that. So at the end of my year at the Constitutional Court, I looked back on these seminars and I looked at some of the people I had the option to engage with at the Constitutional Court and contemplated why not making this a more public thing. Why is it only that a select few clerks in a confidential area within the Constitutional Court can have these discussions about, the movement of South African society, the rule of law, application of socioeconomic rights? Why should it be a closed list and why should it be in confidence? So I identified some of the people I thought were wonderful, both from, at my time at the Constitutional Court, people who I'd met through Varsity, who I'd met through the establishment of other NGOs at the LRC, And I slowly tried to persuade them to join me in this project, which was the ALC, and to start having discussions, not only about constitutional law, but about African human rights law, in the form of a super blog. I wanted to create an organization where people could publish their ideas, they could write, and we could start substantively dealing with law. I wanted it to be focused in South Africa, but also to have a broader African focus for young writers to start testing, looking at our judiciaries, looking at our leaders, looking at our lawmakers, and starting to question why the laws are what they are and what they could become. So we set it up, and anecdotally, and this is something I'm sure some of you who have established NGOs will know, but those who might want in the future, it's about finding the right people. It can be really, really difficult. So I looked for 10 years. I mean, the people that work with me on this now are people I've met over the course of a 10-year period. And they were also very, very difficult people to persuade to join me. I can give you an example. One guy was Leo. He was a clerk at the Constitutional Court, and he's not a man that really enjoys much discussion. He's not going to have a beer with you. He's going to sit at his computer and work. But he's very, very good at his job. And what Leo used to do, and what you'll see tomorrow at the Constitutional Court, is there's the old fort, which is just on top of the court, and there's ramparts. So it's effectively the walls of the fort. And I smoke. I'll go have a cigarette on the roof, and I'd watch Leo kind of, in his own world, just walking around the ramparts of the Constitutional Court. And about 3 months into this project, I figured that this was a place where Leo was comfortable, and if I went and found him on the ramparts, that would be a place I could possibly persuade him to join me. So I waited, I watched, he drinks cappuccinos, went and bought a cappuccino and found him on the ramparts. Had a 2-hour discussion with him, and ultimately I persuaded him to start editing our blog. He now deals with all the young writers. He's doing his PhD at Oxford, but he receives all the submissions, all the legal submissions. He suggests edits to the young writers, and then we start publishing. But it's just an example of if you identify the people that you want to work with, it's sometimes not as easy as just asking them to join you. Sometimes the best people are the hardest to persuade. So we set up, and our purpose has started to write. We write about everything. We criticize the Constitutional Court when we think they got it wrong, but we give reasons for it. We criticize the Judicial Services Commission when they leave a Constitutional Court vacancy for 2 years, which in my view is unconstitutional in and of itself. But we write and we make this public knowledge. And ultimately what we're trying and seeking to do through this particular NGO is to start really debating and grappling with the laws that govern us. I think our Constitution is very relatively young. You look at the more established constitutions, I mean, the Americans have multiple blogs dealing with US Supreme Court decisions. And I think what we're starting to see with, I would suggest, the EFF entering into Parliament and starting broader debate, we're also starting to see a public shift and an enhanced focus on the judiciary as well. I think it's wonderful about our young democracy that our key institutions are now getting far more public focus than they did. I mean, for me, 5 years ago, no one cared about the state of the nation, in my view. Maybe I didn't care at that time. But I can't remember when the first post-State of the Nation debate was published. I remember in 2014 it became a big, big thing. And that's because the EFF were going to make noise. Before then, I don't think anyone really wanted to grapple with it. But it's starting. You look, we're now filming Constitutional Court hearings. They come to matter last week, Tuesday. We're actively starting to engage with our democratic institutions, which I think is fantastic. And what we're trying to do solely with this is to give additional commentary and suggestions about where even our judges get it wrong, where our politicians may get it wrong, and where our lawmakers may get it wrong. So the last thing, or the last 2 things, we established with our funding. And how we did that was by finding the right people and just working harder. Our next steps going forward is we're going to formally establish, we're going to seek funding and try to establish a formal NGO which will all work towards part-time. But again, when you find these people that you really want to join you, oftentimes they might be in heightened demand by other people as well. So it's about establishing that structure where you can offer them a viable product to join you to realize whatever NGO dream you might have. And then the last thing is about experimentalism. So it's a difficult one, and what I mean by it is I think the NGO sector has become quite codified. You litigate, you advocate, you research, or you provide a service. Are there any other NGOs that fall out of that you can think of?
Could you repeat that again?
Litigate, advocate, research, or provide a service. And that's it. Is that the best we have? If we're trying to change the circumstances of people in our country, and our continent, and our community, there must be other ways to look at it. What I've started doing, what the ALC does, and what the LRC has started doing is we're trying to look at different sort of avenues for change. Historically, we litigate. Of course, there's always going to be a need for those 4 baseline NGOs, but there's different ways to do it. Technology has started. It's very, very easy, as some of you may know, to register an NGO in South Africa. It's also very, very easy to apply for public benefit status, which allows a tax rebate as well for funders. These are very easy things to do. So test it, try it. If you have an idea, let it go. Work on it. If it fails, try again. You're not losing any money. It's free to register an NGO. It's free to close it down as well. There's a bit of human capital that goes into having to file documents with the department, but outside of that, test it all. And my only suggestion would be is that when you are going to test it in a formal NGO structure so you protect yourself if it goes wrong. So that's it from the side of the LC. Do you have any questions about this particular organization? Comments, suggestions?
Sorry, when you talk about NGOs going into mistakes, I wanted to know, like, do you know what kind of mistakes, typical mistakes that NGOs make in the information?
So I think the biggest mistakes I've seen is not finding the right people. I can speak to it about here, but what we did is we needed as many people as possible to assist with taking statements and providing advice. We were desperate for people. So we took on anyone we could because we wanted to assist broader aspects of the community. And I think we learned quite hard that a lot of people love the idea. They love the suggestion or the notion of doing good. But when it comes down to actually working late nights, to sitting and drafting multiple statements, to having to miss a Friday night movie or a family lunch, whatever it may be, it becomes very difficult for them to engage. So I think the biggest thing for me would be on the human capital side is again, having an open discussion with people before they join your NGO and ascertaining exactly what it is they can offer. I don't think you should assume that as the initiator of that idea or the founder, that everyone will want to buy into the cause as much as you will. But there will be people who want to offer 1 hour a week, 1 day a week, 3 days a week. And that's a discussion you have. So I think one of the biggest failings is going too quickly and taking on too many people who aren't prepared or willing to do the work. Another core concern is, again, I think taking on too much work. So when you start getting into donor funding, you need to persuade donors that you've got a consistent stream of work, that you're doing something innovative, and you're doing things that people actually need within a community. And I think the primary reaction is to take on as much work as possible so you can put as much as possible into your donor report and ultimately receive more funding to expand your NGO. But then you run into this kind of dual issue of having taken on too much work, not having the adequate human capital to deal with it. It all falls on your desk and it can make life quite difficult. So I think for me, those are the sort of 2 concerns that you want to look at, amongst others. These are just experiences I've had, but in starting NGOs. So, I mean, that's for the LCI. I look for these people for a long time, and I hope it works out. But it's really something you should start contemplating. And it's not solely within your friends group or your family. I mean, look broadly, but it will take time to find people who you work well with, who share similar ideologies, and are ultimately prepared to put in really, really long hours for very limited pay or social benefit. So yeah, that's it from my side. 1, 2, 3.
Mine was just not clear confusion between the house that Freedom Charter is an ANC document. Freedom Charter is a people's document, not ANC document. And also very important that NGOs can associate themselves with parties, political parties, because some of the political parties are the ones who are in government and they can get funding. There are some specific departments that need to fund NGOs.
Sure. So I agree and I disagree. Give me 5 minutes. We'll just take this question and maybe if we could have just a 5-minute debate on the political question. Yeah.
Now, I was just curious more about the African Legal Center work. And I saw there was like it was a Rewriting Africa's Borders project.
Sure.
If you could just speak a little bit about that, and also like legal epistemologies and systems from the continent that might offer solutions that haven't come from Western legal systems?
Very, very good question. On the first concern, so what we do at the ALC is, it's again about trying to innovate and try to find new project areas that haven't been looked at. We have a couple of focus areas. The two primary ones, which are very nascent, they're still in development. The first is the Liberty Map. And what we're effectively doing is mapping out Africa, and over time we're going to start charting every single human rights violation that occurs on the continent and track that violation. So we'll have 3 separate flags, a red flag, an orange flag, and a green flag. The red flag will be a human rights violation that hasn't been investigated. An orange flag will be a human rights violation that's in the process of being investigated. And a green flag will be violation investigated and settled, either through a prosecution or through a reparations process. So Liberty Map is trying to create a visual effect of how damning some of the conduct of African states, African rebel groups, and just individuals on our continent have been, and creating this map to show how grave a lot of the human rights violations have been, particularly on our continent. We then want to expand that more broadly, but we have to start on one continent first. It's a lot of work. African Borders Revisited looks at tracking sort of the colonial notion of the establishment of Africa and why, in fact, we have the borders we do. A lot of the conflict we see going on the continent is ethnic, and it's a result, in my view, in many aspects, because of the borders that have been drawn and have been agreed to as well. So it's not so much so that we're pushing at this stage yet for an alteration in our borders, which is something that politically would be very, very difficult. It's not something that I think we'll realize. But it's more of us seeking to test whether or not we could look at finding a structure in Africa and an ideal border that could mitigate the effects of war on the continent. Again, it's more of it's an intellectual endeavor that we're engaging on to see how, in fact, we could mitigate this. And to the extent that one day we seek to take it to the African Commission, maybe so. But these are long-term research projects, but something that we want to start. As to interesting community initiatives, I think South Africa's got a fantastic one through the Constitutional Court, which you're going to learn about next year, but it's the notion of community justice, or what you'll learn at the court is justice under a tree. And that was adopted in Rwanda with the Gacaca courts, which is a very similar process. So it's a transitional justice mechanism, and transitional justice focuses on what you do with a society once it comes out of conflict. South Africa's mechanism was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Depending on which side you fall, I think a lot of people would agree that it failed quite spectacularly. Some people would argue that it averted war. It was the mechanism that was chosen at the time, but there are others. So the Gacaca Court was another mechanism, which was a truth-telling mechanism. And what people did is victims of grave human rights violations would get together in communities, and they would have community-style courts. They would sit and discuss the violations that they had faced, and the communities themselves would decide whether or not to pardon the offenders, and if not, they would suggest formal prosecutions. Gacaca. G-A-C-H-A-G-A-C-H-A. So that's a really, really wonderful mechanism that I thought. The reason I subscribe to it is it speaks directly to public participation. I think when you look at any transitional justice mechanism, you have to start a healing process, and that healing process should start with the victims. Where the TRC had slight difficulties, and maybe grave difficulties, and looked at direct victims only. It didn't look at broader and majority communities who had suffered mass atrocities indirectly through apartheid. It looked at direct victims of murders, of disappearances, of kidnappings, but not of broader community issues, which is some of the debate we're still having. I think it's a reason for a lot of the issue we currently have in South Africa still, is that we didn't have this notion of justice. We relied on amnesty, and in fairness, in my view, amnesty is wholly discredited in international law. It's not a justifiable remedy when it comes to a grave human rights violation. And remembering apartheid is a just cogence norm. So there's 6 just cogence norms: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, apartheid, trading in slaves, and piracy. And when you're dealing with one of those crimes, it's a whole different ballgame, effectively. I don't think we give enough consideration to the need for transitional justice on that.
Two things. You engage papers from legal scholars, and secondly, what's your opinion about the whole ICC and the leader of Sudan? How do you handle that?
So directly, one, we accept papers that relate to sort of human rights or human rights related issues on the continent. So it can be social papers, they don't have to be purely legal, as long as it is a human rights based focus, between 1,000 and 2,000 words, and then you'll go through the editorial process, which is about a 2-week process before publication. As to South Africa and Al Bashir, I must disclose that we intervened. We were in Bloemfontein on Friday. We intervened to join Mozambique Cura on behalf of an international and domestic NGO. On some of the points about immunity, I think there's a discussion. What, in my view, is deeply problematic is that a court order was granted and the state failed to act. So the basic tenet for me of the rule of law is that the executive and the legislature and all people, both natural and juristic, are bound by court orders. If you're not happy with the court order, you still comply, but then you appeal it. What the South African government sought to do here was to not comply with the court order and then appeal it after the fact. That's antithetical to the rule of law, because what you have then, if we don't have a regulation, the judiciary doesn't have an army, it doesn't have a police service, it can't go arrest you. It's assumed that all people will abide by the law. If individuals don't abide by the law, the police service kicks in. But when heads of state or executive branches of government don't abide, there's a serious tension between the different spheres. You can't arrest cabinet. You can't arrest government, the union buildings. If you went for contempt proceedings, you could arrest individual members, but we're not dealing with that yet. The baseline premise is that the court made a decision, the government refused to act on it, and now tries to appeal it after the fact, which is the wrong way to look at it, in my opinion. Last question, I think. Yeah.
It's not easy to separate the political party from government. But when you look at the government in terms of the service or in terms of the constitution, the government is that which puts all the, the administrative laws, etc. In that way, look at government in that way, then obviously is an NGO in new government. But if you want to look at government in the sense of a political party which needs to be voted for, then now that's a different thing altogether. So he said that, Comrade said that the people, NGOs need the political parties. I think he actually meant government. The same applies with the gentleman before.
So, brief response.
The thing is, we fail to understand that the government policies are the policies of the ANC because they are the one in charge. Therefore, it's very important if you want to do something, you can align yourself with them in order to advance your cause.
I'm going to have to cut it. Can I suggest this? I just want to wrap up.
Because I also want
well, let me suggest this. I just wanted to thank everyone for your time. Thank you for having me. It's a really humbling experience to be asked to speak to all of you, and it's really wonderful to see so many people wanting to move into civil society work. I really hope that somewhere along the road we get to work together. It'll be a wonderful thing. On the last topic, which seems to be the hardest topic of debate during this seminar, I just have one thing to say, and then I think you should have this debate, but have a fuller debate when you have time for the rest of the week. On the alignment or otherwise of NGOs, the one consideration there should always be is that someone has to watch the government. Someone has to watch individual members of the government, and someone has to watch other state institutions. And oftentimes NGOs also need to play that role. So I don't think it should be prohibitive or definitive. I don't think it should be that either should be aligned or not aligned. But there always needs to be scope for independent NGOs who observe everybody and call out misconduct where it occurs. And if you are aligned, it becomes more difficult to do that. So that's just my last word on that topic. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time.